me. Let me tell you something most people are too afraid to say out loud. You weren't too much. You weren't difficult. You weren't hard to love. You were different. And that terrified him. From the very beginning, he felt it, that quiet, unsettling truth. You didn't need to shrink to be chosen. You didn't beg for attention. You didn't lose yourself just to keep someone comfortable. And that kind of woman, that kind of presence. It doesn't confuse weak men. It exposes them. You walked into his life with depth, with emotional honesty, with standards that weren't loud but unmovable. You asked real questions. You expected real answers. You weren't interested in half love, vague promises, or emotional crumbs. And that's when the fear began. Because when a woman knows who she is, she becomes a mirror. And not everyone is brave enough to face what they see staring back. Your confidence didn't come from tension. Your strength didn't come from approval. You carried your own sense of worth, and that threatened the version of himself he was pretending to be. So he tried to label you intense, too emotional, not like other women, as if that was an insult. But here's the truth. You weren't like other women because you refused to disappear for love. You refused to play small so someone else could feel big. And the moment he realized he couldn't control you, couldn't dilute you, couldn't tame your spirit, he felt exposed. And fear always looks for an escape. Here's what no one told you. Your strength wasn't loud, it was grounded. And grounded women don't chase, they choose. You didn't need constant reassurance because you trusted yourself. You didn't collapse when things got uncomfortable. You leaned in. You asked for clarity. You spoke when something felt off instead of swallowing it to keep the peace. And for someone who survives on avoidance, that kind of courage feels dangerous. Because your presence demanded truth, you didn't force him to change. You simply made it impossible for him to hide. Around you, excuses didn't land. Half effort was visible. Emotional inconsistency stood naked in the room. You weren't trying to expose him, but your authenticity did it anyway. And that's when the shift happened. He started pulling back, not because you were too close, but because you were too real. Your expectations weren't unreasonable. They were honest. You wanted connection, not control. Growth, not comfort. Depth, not performance. But growth requires accountability. And accountability feels like threat to someone who hasn't made peace with themselves. So instead of rising to meet you, he began shrinking the story. He questioned your needs. He reframed your boundaries as demands. He called your emotional intelligence overthinking, because acknowledging your insight meant confronting his own lack of it. Understand this? When a man is unsettled by a woman's clarity, it's not because she's confusing, it's because she's clear. You didn't scare him by loving deeply. You scared him because you wouldn't abandon yourself to be loved. And somewhere deep inside, he knew if he stayed, he'd have to grow. And he wasn't ready to meet the woman who already had. There's always a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when he understands the truth. It's the moment he realizes you won't twist yourself into a shape that fits his comfort. You didn't compete for his attention. You didn't monitor his moods or chase his validation. When he pulled away, you didn't panic, you noticed. When his words didn't match his actions, you didn't argue, you remembered. And that's when control slipped through his fingers, because control thrives on uncertainty, on self-doubt, on a woman questioning her worth instead of questioning the situation. But you didn't do that. You trusted your instincts. You honored what your body felt before your mind could rationalize it away. You didn't need him to choose you to feel chosen. And that was terrifying. He tried subtle tests, delayed replies, emotional distance, mixed signals, waiting to see if you'd bend, waiting to see if you'd over-explain, apologize for needs you never should have had to justify. But you didn't. You stayed steady. You stayed kind. You stayed you. And that's when he knew manipulation wouldn't work here. Guilt wouldn't land. Silence wouldn't break you. You weren't attached to the fantasy of him. You were anchored in the truth of yourself. So he felt exposed again, smaller, unarmed. because a woman who can walk away without bitterness is a woman who was never owned to begin with. You weren't cold. You were self-respecting. And self-respect is the one thing control cannot survive. Fear rarely shows up as fear. It shows up as distance, as silence, as confusion wrapped in politeness. When he couldn't control you, he didn't confront it. He retreated. He became harder to read, slower, to respond, less present. Not because you asked for too much, but because you were asking for what was real, and real requires courage. He told himself stories to make the fear manageable, that you were intense, that you expected too much, that the timing was off. These narratives weren't about you. They were shields protecting him from the discomfort of growth, because staying close to you meant staying awake. You noticed the shift immediately. You felt it in the pauses, in the softened enthusiasm, in the way warmth turned conditional. And you didn't explode. You didn't chase. You didn't perform emotional gymnastics to earn consistency. You simply observed. And observation is powerful. Instead of explaining himself honestly, he let ambiguity do the work. He hoped you'd fill in the gaps with self-doubt. He hoped you'd blame yourself, lower your expectations, make it easier for him to stay without changing. But you didn't. You held your ground with grace. You kept your boundaries intact without turning cold. You remained open without becoming available to disrespect. And that made the distance louder, because distance only works when the other person is afraid of losing you. You weren't afraid. You were aware. So his fear deepened, not of you, but of what being with you would require. Presence, integrity, emotional responsibility. And when someone isn't ready to show up fully, they don't leave loudly, they fade. When distance wasn't enough, he reached for something quieter. Doubt, not obvious, not cruel, just subtle enough to make you question your footing. He started reframing your intuition as insecurity, your boundaries as rigidity, your need for honesty as pressure. He didn't say it outright, he implied it. An implication is powerful because it invites you to finish the sentence for him. That's how self-trust erodes. He hoped you'd soften your edges, that you'd second guess what you felt so clearly in your body, that you'd start asking, am I asking for too much? Am I reading this wrong? Am I the problem? But here's what he didn't understand. You had already done the work. You knew the difference between fear and intuition, between anxiety and truth. You didn't confuse discomfort with danger. You didn't mistake emotional avoidance for mystery. You could feel when something was misaligned, and you trusted that feeling even when it hurt. And that's why his tactics didn't land. Because doubt only sticks when a woman has been taught to distrust herself. You hadn't. You had learned slowly, painfully, that clarity is kinder than confusion, and silence speaks louder than excuses. So instead of shrinking, you got quieter, not smaller, clearer. You stopped explaining. You stopped convincing. You stopped trying to translate yourself into something easier to digest. And that's when he felt it slipping away. Because a woman who stops arguing is no longer fighting for the relationship. She's listening to herself. And once a woman chooses herself without anger, without drama, without apology, there is no turning back. There's a moment that changes everything. It's the moment you stop trying to be understood by someone who has already decided not to see you. You didn't announce it. You didn't threaten to leave. You didn't demand reassurance. You simply withdrew your emotional labor. And that kind of shift is seismic because he was used to women explaining themselves, softening their needs, negotiating their worth. He was comfortable in dynamics where confusion kept him safe. But you chose clarity. You stopped chasing closure. You stopped waiting for the conversation that would finally make him show up. You stopped translating his behavior into hope. And in that quiet decision, you reclaimed something powerful. Your energy, he felt it immediately. The ease was gone. The access was gone. The emotional availability he took for granted was no longer freely offered. Not as punishment, but as protection. And that unsettled him. Because power doesn't look like control, it looks like choice, and you were choosing yourself without bitterness, without cruelty, without performance. You didn't need to prove you were valuable. You acted like you knew it. That's when the fear sharpened. Because now he wasn't losing you to another person. He was losing you to yourself, to your self-respect, to your alignment, to your refusal to stay where your depth was treated like inconvenience. And there's no competition with that. He realized too late, the woman he feared wasn't the one who demanded more. It was the one who quietly realized she deserved it. You didn't leave in flames. You didn't leave with accusations or ultimatums. You didn't even leave loudly. You left whole. And that's what undid him. Because he expected grief to weaken you. He expected silence to punish you. He expected distance to make you come back asking for answers. But what he didn't expect was your peace. You walked away without rewriting the story to make him the villain. You didn't need him to admit fault for you to accept the truth. You didn't chase accountability from someone who was never ready to carry it. You trusted what you felt, and you honored it. That kind of departure doesn't bruise the ego. It confronts the soul. Because now there was no drama to hide behind. No chaos to justify the ending. Just the quiet realization that he lost someone who loved deeply, saw clearly, and asked honestly, because he couldn't meet her where she stood. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you cared enough about yourself not to stay in emotional scarcity. And that haunted him, because the absence you created wasn't empty. It was intentional. It was full of self-respect, full of boundaries, full of a woman who finally chose alignment over attachment. You didn't collapse without him. You expanded. And expansion is terrifying to someone who lives in limitation. He didn't lose you because you were too much. He lost you because you were enough, and he knew it. Time passed. Life moved on. The noise returned, but you stayed, not physically, internally, because you were never just a relationship. You were a reckoning. He meets other women now. Conversations happen. Connections form. But something is missing, not because they aren't worthy, but because they don't require him to rise. They don't see through the cracks. They don't ask for depth where he learned to survive on surface. And that's when your presence returns. In the pauses, in the moments of emotional honesty he avoids, in the quiet awareness of what could have been. You weren't perfect, but you were present. You were emotionally literate. You were brave enough to stay open and wise enough to walk away. And that combination leaves an imprint, because you didn't beg to be chosen. You didn't need to be rescued. You didn't try to fix him. You simply showed him what a grounded, self-aware woman looks like, and then you removed yourself when it wasn't met with respect. That memory doesn't fade. It lingers because it carries a question he can't answer without doing the work. What if I had been braver? You became a benchmark, a moment of clarity in a life built on avoidance. Not a fantasy, a reality he wasn't ready to live. And that's why he remembers you. Not because you haunted him, but because you woke him, here's the part that matters most. Even if he never admits it, you were never meant to stay. You were meant to teach, not with lectures, not with ultimatums, but with embodiment, with the way you lived your truth without apology, with the way you loved deeply without abandoning yourself, with the way you left without needing revenge. Your presence disrupted a pattern he had relied on, the pattern of comfort without growth. You showed him that connection isn't built on charm or chemistry alone. It's built on emotional responsibility, on consistency, on the courage to be seen. And that lesson landed whether he wanted it to or not. Because now, every time he avoids a hard conversation, he remembers you. Every time he chooses distance over depth, he feels the cost. Every time he senses a woman asking for more truth than he's ready to give, something in him tightens. That's awareness. And awareness is irreversible. You didn't change him by staying. You changed him by leaving intact, by refusing to become bitter, by refusing to beg, by refusing to contort yourself into something easier to keep. You showed him the difference between being desired and being worthy of love. And whether he grows from that or runs from it is no longer your responsibility. Your role was never to save him. Your role was to reveal what love asks of us. Here's the truth you get to keep. You were never rejected. You were recognized as a woman who couldn't be molded, minimized, or managed, recognized as someone whose depth demanded integrity, recognized as someone who didn't just love, but lived in alignment with that love. And that recognition scared him because loving you required presence, choosing you required courage, staying with you required growth, and not everyone is ready to meet a woman who has already done her work. So let this end cleanly. You don't need closure from someone who couldn't show up. You don't need validation from someone who felt threatened by your wholeness. You don't need to be understood by someone who benefited from misunderstanding you. You carry the ending inside you. You walk forward knowing this being not like other women was never a flaw. It was your power. Your emotional depth wasn't a burden. Your clarity wasn't cruelty. Your standards weren't walls, they were gateways. The right person won't be terrified by your truth. They'll be steadied by it. So don't shrink. Don't soften what made you real. Don't apologize for being the woman who changed the room simply by being honest in it. Some people are meant to love you. Others are meant to learn from you. And you were always meant to keep becoming.